Hi and welcome back. I know it's been a while and we can thank 2020 for that. But I still hope you guys are doing fine despite all the trouble we have had so far. So as you can see, I have moved into a new place. Finally. I spent most of my summer looking for new apartments and it took a while, but finally I found the perfect apartment for me, which has a lot of space for my studio setup. The actual move took a little bit longer than anticipated because of the pandemic and the work situation and everything, so it took me about 2.5 months, including the move and building the studio all together. But now it's finally ready, so why don't we take a little look at the process getting here. Starting off to my left, I have my main mixing console, the Yamaha LS932. And underneath you'll find the Korg M1R EX, the Wave Station AD, the M3R and the TR rack. Sliding over to the right, you'll find the Korg DVP-1 and the EX8000. And the DW8P controller from Retroactive. At the bottom I have a Neutrik NYS SPPL1 patch bay. On the left side of the main position, the Ensoniq DP4 Plus, the Silver Bullet from Ladder and Liftoff, and the Antares ATR1. Everything is mastered through the Silver Bullet, which is then fed into the SSL2 Plus as the last recording input for mixdown. My reference monitors are the Dyn Audio Lyd 48 from Denmark, a step up from the previous VM6A Mark II. As with the previous setup, the center console is where everything happens. I still use my Yamaha Motif XS7 as the master keyboard, and the Mackie Big Knob is still controlling the monitors. Less frequently used gear is the Korg Volcabeats and the BL1 and VT1 from Boss. Moving on to the right, the Marker Korg and the Behringer X32 rack with the S16 snakes are handling most of the inputs on the right side. Moving on, we have the Roland TR707, the R8 and the Alesis HR16 drum machine. Well-known drum machines from the late 80s and the early 90s. On the keyboard tier below, you'll find the Roland JX3P, prominently featured in one of Espen Kraft's videos earlier. Then there's the Roland D50 with the PG1000 controller. And below that you'll have the Roland W30. This was Roland's first attempt at making a complete workstation with sampler and sequencer back in the late 80s. Most famously used by Prodigy amongst others. And at the bottom of the first rack there is the Roland JD800, one of the more aesthetic looking keyboards from the early 90s. Moving over to the second keyboard stand, you'll find the Yamaha Reface CS and the Reface DX. And then we have the Ensoniq TS10, a really powerful workstation with all the bells and whistles from the 90s. Then we have the Ensoniq Fismo, one of the more stranger and exciting wavetable synths out there. And of course my setup wouldn't be complete without the Ensoniq SD1. And below you'll find the Korg DSS1 sampling keyboard. Perhaps not the most used keyboard in my collection, but it's still a nice one to have. Moving on to the third keyboard stand, you'll find the Roland Alpha Juno 2. Below that you'll find the Yamaha DX9, a 4-operator budget version of the DX7. Then there's the Yamaha V50, another 4-operator keyboard with an 8-part sequencer. And now we're moving on to one of my first keyboards that I owned, the Technics KN1000, which for a very brief moment surpassed both Roland and Yamaha with its 32-voice polyphony. And some years later they followed with the KN2000. This was also the first to have 64-voice polyphony and a full-blown 16-track sequencer. Moving on to the last keyboard stand, you'll find the Akai AX60. Maybe not the most exciting synth out there, but it's connected with the S612 for expandability. And one tier down you'll find the Roland D70. Perhaps one of Roland's more overhyped releases, but the sound is still pretty good. And here we have one of my earlier workhorses, the Roland XP-AT. This was the only workstation I had back in the mid-90s. Moving on, we have the Yamaha SY99, their flagship of 1991 and was used by a lot of famous artists. And the last of the active keyboards in my studio at the moment is the Roland U20. Nothing fancy about this, but it's still a nice little relic from the 80s. I also have this Tascam TSR8 8-track recorder, which will be implemented later into the studio. And at the top of the rack I have an assortment of late 80s, early 90s Roland modules for computer and such. You'll also find a Korg MS-20 USB controller. On the left side of the rack there is a Roland S760 sampler with hard drive and zip drive. Next to it is the MPG50 from Retroactive and the Roland S770 sampler, which was previously used by Magne Furholmen in Aha. And then you have the MPG70, which is a controller for the Roland MKS70. On the next row we have the Boss SX700 multi-effect and the Focusrite Voicemaster Platinum Pro, all together with the second Behringer X32 rack with the S16 expander. And here in the middle we have a couple of Behringer line mixers for submixing of all the small modules, as well as the EMU Proteus 1. And all of these submixes are sent to the Yamaha LS9. And on the far right there is the self-explanatory Roland rack with the D, U, SC, JV and JD series. I would say the 90s is really strong here. As I was running out of rack space when I was building, I found out these 8-unit racks from Toolman Music were perfect for stacking. Anyway, let's move on to the last bit. This is what I want to call my wall of modules. In addition to all the 8-unit racks from Toolman Music, there are also 3 21-unit racks from Koenig und Maya. To the left there is more miscellaneous stuff like Akai, Alesis, Ensoniq, Oberheim and Kurzweil. The rack in the middle is dedicated to Yamaha, while the last one is dedicated to Roland. So let's start with the first rack. All racks in my studio are powered by the Adam Hall PCL 10 Pro power conditioners. And then you'll find Motu, or Mark of the Unicorn, MIDI Express 128. Next up is the Alesis QSR, or the Quadrasynth in a rack module. I also have two Akai S612 digital samplers, one with the Gotek drive and one with the old MD280 disk drive. Furthermore, you find the Oberheim Matrix 1000 and a couple of Ensoniq modules, the MR rack and the ESQ-M. At the bottom you find two Kurzweils, 1000PX and 1000HX, the horn expander. All audio from this rack is submixed in the Behringer X32 above and then fed into the Yamaha LS9. In the Yamaha rack I'm using the same Adam Hall power conditioner, but I'm using a Roland M160 line mixer for submixing. And the reason is because of the nice form factor and the fact that the Roland mixers have enough inputs and outputs. You'll also find another Motu interface for this rack. Since the mixers don't have any built-in effects, I wanted to use some of my analog outboard gear for this. So the first effects channel is handled by the Lexicon PCM70, while the second one is colored by the Yamaha SPX90 Mark II. The first sound module is the Yamaha FS1R, followed by the Motif rack, two TX81 sets, one TG77 and one TX816. So even though I don't have any DX7, I'm well covered with FM sounds as it is. Moving on to the Roland side, it's the same as before, Adam Hall power conditioner, Roland M160 mixer, Motu interface and Lexicon PCM70. But now the second FX channel is handled by the Yamaha Rev 7. As for Roland modules, we start with the MKS20, the digital piano. Below that, the MKS30 or the JX3P in a box, almost. Then we have the MKS50 or the Alpha Juno 2 in module form. Further down we have the MKS70 or the Super Jupiter. And last but not least, my crown jewel, the Roland MKS80. And now you probably want to know how it's all connected, so let's have a look at the audio and MIDI setup. In this new setup I have around 60 keyboards and modules in total. And while some of these devices have more than two outputs, I'm normally just using the one stereo output as default, which means that I'm looking at least 120 mono channels. And since the LS9 only has 32 analog channels and 32 digital, I had to use extra mixers to submix everything first. I tried to keep every rack self-contained with power, MIDI and network data. The intention was to keep all the unshielded cables as short as possible. My trusty sound cards from Motu died on me this year, so I had to find a new solution to send audio between the DAW and the LS9 mixer. And the best solution seemed to be the Dante over network. So with two new expansion cards for the LS9, I can now have 32 channels in and out just by using a normal network switch. As for MIDI, it's basically the same as the previous setup, just more interfaces. I now have a 7 Motu MIDI Express 128 and 1 MIDI Express XT. To minimize the long runs of MIDI cables, I spread the interfaces across the studio. This is the current MIDI layout as seen in Apple's audio and MIDI setup. You can add all your devices, name them and set the properties, as well as diagram all the cable connections. And as usual, this will reflect the MIDI layout in your DAW and you can easily select your modules as you like. And as usual, I'm still using Motu's Digital Performer 8.5 as my main DAW. Unfortunately, I did not have enough money to upgrade the Mac this time, so it'll have to wait until maybe next year. Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this tour. That's it for now. Thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next one.